Hello, I'm David Hilson, the Risk Doctor, and I'd like to talk to you about risk culture. This talk is called the ABC of risk culture because one of the Risk Doctor mottos is to understand profoundly so you can explain simply. So we know that culture is a very complex subject. What I hope to do in this short presentation is to demystify it and give you some practical ways to understand and develop a risk-mature culture. So let's start with first principles. What do you think of when you hear the word culture? A lot of people will think of images like this, with music or dance or drama or film. Or perhaps you think of other images of words that end in culture, like agriculture or horticulture or silviculture, that's growing trees, or viniculture, which is growing grapes. Well, that's all very well for the man on the street, but there is, of course, a more academic, a more technical definition of culture. And on this slide, I've pulled three of the definitions from the most leading thinkers in the field of culture. We've got a definition from Geert Hofstede, the Dutchman, another definition from Edgar Schein, perhaps the leading academic thinker on culture, and one from Vijay Sathe. And here you'll see with their various definitions, there are two common themes amongst them all. One is that culture is something which is shared. So they use words like the collective, or the group, or the community. And the second point about culture is that it's something internal and invisible. So we talk about culture being something of the mind, something of our understandings or our perceptions. And these two factors, that culture is shared by a group and that culture is something internal and invisible, are very important when we come to understand and manage our risk culture. So to produce a working definition of culture, I'd like to draw on some research that I did with the Institute of Risk Management, the IRM, in 2012. And here's the definition that we came up with, which draws on decades of understanding from the academics and from the philosophers and from our own practical experience. So we define culture as the values, beliefs, knowledge and understanding which is shared by a group of people with a common purpose. And I'd like to unpack some of the things behind that definition using a simple model that we call the ABC model. Well, it won't surprise you to know that C stands for culture. But where does culture come from? Culture comes from repeated behavior. If we do the same things over and over again, it will form the culture of the group. But where does behavior come from? Behavior comes from the way that we think, from our internal attitudes. So our attitudes shape our behavior, and repeated behavior forms culture, A, B, C. But of course there's a feedback because our culture in turn influences the way that we think and the way that we act. So then we have the full ABC model where attitude shapes behavior, behavior forms culture, and culture in turn influences both attitude and behavior. So on this slide, we just unpack that diagram in words, that culture is formed by repeated behavior. Behavior is shaped by the underlying attitudes, and both behavior and attitudes are influenced by the prevailing culture of the group. And with this cyclic set of interdependent relationships, we can form cycles which are reinforcing. Of course, the cycle could be bad. We could have a vicious cycle where thinking in the wrong way about risk, about anything really, thinking in the wrong way can lead us to inappropriate behavior. And that inappropriate behavior leads to a negative culture. And that in turn reinforces the poor thinking and the poor behavior. On the other hand, we could have a positive cycle, a virtuous cycle, where good thinking, where appropriate and mature thinking leads to the right kind of behavior, which in turn forms a positive and strong culture, which then feeds back to support the right kind of thinking and behaving. So that's the ABC model in its basic form. And it's based on a number of definitions, underlying definitions, which are shown on this slide. We've already seen that culture is the values, beliefs, knowledge and understanding shared by a group of people with a common purpose. But what about A and B? Attitude is the chosen position adopted by an individual or group in relation to a given situation and influenced by their perception of that situation. And behaviour, of course, are the things that we can see, the external observable actions, including our decisions and our communications and so on. So that's the generic ABC model of culture. We can, of course, make that into a model of risk culture by defining A, B and C for risk. So here we have definitions of risk attitude, the chosen position adopted by an individual or group in relation to risk and influenced by their risk perception. We can have risk-based behaviour, those external and observable risk-related actions, including our risk-based decision-making and processes and so on. And those in turn will form a risk culture, which is the internal values, beliefs, knowledge and understanding about risk, shared by a group of people with a common purpose. And with these definitions, we can form an ABC model for risk. So we see that risk culture of an organisation or a project team or a management board is formed by, is shaped by the repeated behaviour of that group towards risk. It's risk-based behaviour. And that risk-based behaviour is in turn driven by the risk attitudes of the individuals and the group. So those risk attitudes will shape the risk-based behaviour. The risk-based behaviour will in turn form the risk culture. And then the risk culture will feed back to influence the way that we think and act towards risk. So now we have an ABC model for risk culture, not just for culture in general. There are some things that we can derive from the ABC model which are true of culture in general, and they are specifically true about risk culture. So the first thing to say is that A is not C. Attitude is not culture. What that means is that we can't use the words that we use to describe risk attitude in order to describe risk culture. They're different things. So attitude is a way of thinking, and then culture is our knowledge and understanding and values and beliefs. So we can't use words like risk averse or risk seeking or risk tolerant about risk culture. Those are words we use to describe risk attitude. And the second obvious thing from the ABC model is that B is not C either. And so we can't use the very common phrase, the way we do things around here, to describe culture. The way we do things, of course, is our behaviour. So we need to be very clear about the distinction between attitudes, behaviour and culture and the relationships between them, so that if we want to develop a risk mature or a risk aware culture, we know what we're dealing with in terms of the influences on that, the attitudes and the behaviour, in order to build that culture. There's a couple of other things which come from the definition. One is that we talk about a number of components of culture. So we talk about values, beliefs, knowledge and understanding. And culture is not a unitary thing. It's not a single concept. There are a number of underlying parts that go to make up culture. And of course, what we ought to be doing if we're wanting to develop a risk mature culture is to pay attention to each of those components, each of those elements. I won't have time in this short presentation to unpack those elements in turn, but there is good work on each of those areas, values, beliefs, knowledge and understanding about risk that we need to consider. The second thing is that if we define risk culture as those values, beliefs, knowledge and understanding about risk shared by a group of people with a common purpose, there are of course many groups of people with common purposes within an organisation. We have the whole organisation itself, so we could have a corporate risk culture. We have our senior management team and our boards, so we could have a management risk culture. We have project teams, so we could have a project risk culture, or we have a wider stakeholder network within the project community. So we see that risk culture is a multi-level concept, and it's important if we want to have an effective and strong risk culture to have all of those areas coherent and aligned with each other. We don't want to have an organisational risk culture which is different from a project risk culture, for example, because that will lead to conflicts and misunderstandings and make it very difficult for the two to communicate with each other. Why does risk culture matter? Everybody says it's important, and we know we should have one, and we should have a good, strong one, but why? I think there are three different types of reasons. The first is because it meets a compliance requirement. There are standards which say we should have, organizations should have, an expressed mature risk culture. And on this slide are two examples, one from the international standard, the ISO 31000 standard, which says that management is responsible for ensuring that the organization's overall culture and its risk policy are aligned, and that our management decisions should lead to improvements in our risk culture. And then people like Standard & Poor's and the other regulatory ratings agencies say similar things. They will assess an organization's risk culture as one of the key influences on its ability to manage risk effectively. So we have to have a strong risk culture, because otherwise we're not going to be compliant either with international best practice in the standards or with the requirements of the regulators and the ratings agencies. But there's a second reason why risk culture matters, which is, I think, more important than mere compliance. And that's because poor risk culture can cause failure, either business failure or project failure. Indeed, poor risk culture has caused failure, and we've got some very good examples of that in the recent past if we look at the global financial crisis following 2008. In the UK, Sir David Walker published a very influential report early on in the financial crisis in 2009, looking at the way that corporate governance influenced behaviour in the financial crisis. And he said that the principal emphasis in many areas is on behaviour and culture. Well, Sir David got two elements of the ABC model there, but he did, of course, miss the all-important area of risk attitude and the way that we think. But we'll come back to that in a moment. And then the Financial Reporting Council, looking at the global financial crisis a little later on, after it had been going for a little while, said that issues that companies are grappling with include understanding their exposure to risk and how that might change, and then embedding the right risk culture throughout the company. So we see from these quotes that people who have looked at these situations recently and analysed what happened when things went wrong have decided that risk culture, and culture more generally, was a key influence in poor management decision making and ultimately business failure. So we've got two reasons why risk culture is important. It's something we have to do for compliance reasons, and it's something that is good for our management decision making, and if we don't do it, we'll be in trouble. But I think there's a third reason, and for me this is the most important reason of all. A strong risk culture will affect the effectiveness of our ability to manage risk, and a weak risk culture will also affect the way that we manage risk. So the Institute of Risk Management, in its risk culture reports in 2012 that I mentioned earlier on, this research project, said that the prevailing risk culture within an organization can make it significantly better or significantly worse in the way it manages risks. And this, of course, is because of this vicious or virtuous circle that we talked about earlier on, and the relationship between attitude, behavior, and culture, that if we get into a bad way of thinking and behaving towards risk and build a negative risk culture, that will flow through into the way that we manage risk across the organization and make it less effective. Whereas if we think appropriately about risk and then act properly towards risk within a strong risk culture, then we'll be more able to manage our risk effectively, leading to the achievement of our objectives across the organization. So we have three compliance reasons, three good reasons for considering risk culture and for making sure that it's something that we pay attention to. There are, of course, many examples of both good and bad risk culture in recent history, and I'm just going to show a few logos and company logos for you to look at, and maybe you might decide for yourself which of these expresses a strong culture towards risk and which expresses a less strong culture towards risk. Perhaps I shouldn't actually name names myself in a recording. I don't want to libel anybody or get myself into trouble. But some of these are very good examples of taking appropriate risks within a strong risk culture, and some are not such good examples. So I think we need to think about how we develop a good risk culture. Clearly it's important for compliance reasons, for the reasons of preventing failure, and for the reasons of supporting effective management of risk. But how do we go about actually developing a good risk culture? Well, we can employ a very simple gap analysis process in the form of some kind of cultural diagnostic. And the gap analysis process has very simple steps. You first of all need to understand where you are and then define where you want to be and understand between those two places what needs to change. Then you design and implement a tailored risk culture change program, and then you implement it and re-benchmark at the end of that program to see if you've made an improvement and what needs to change going forward. So that's the basic shape of any gap analysis and improvement program. How do we have cultural diagnostics that will help us understand where we are and where we want to be in terms of risk culture? Well, the research program that I mentioned with the Institute of Risk Management in 2012 drew together a model of risk culture which we can use to support that kind of cultural diagnostic. And I'm going to give you the references for the IRM reports at the end of this presentation. So the IRM Risk Culture Aspects model offers a number of different elements against which we can self-assess our own culture in our organizations or in our teams to see how we're doing. Now, without going into lots of detail, and you can of course see this model in the online reports from the IRM, I can show you on this next slide that the Risk Culture Aspects model has 4 basic aspects, because it's the Risk Culture Aspects model. Those are the tone at the top and how that determines our management of risk. That's governance, how we actually control the way that risk is managed within the organization. It's decision making in terms of how we use the results of the risk process to drive our decisions across the organization. And it's the area of competency and whether or not we are able to manage risk well. And then each of those 4 aspects has 2 diagnostic elements underneath it, so that we can use those to describe whether or not that particular aspect is being effective. So tone at the top is driven by our leadership in terms of risk management. How is that shown by our key leaders, our senior leaders, and also leaders in our project and program organizations? And are we offering a clear direction of how risk should be managed within the organization? Governance involves clear accountabilities for risk management and also transparency of risk information, so we know what the main risks are and why they matter. In terms of decision making, we need to make sure that our risk-based decisions are well informed by the threats and opportunities that we face and the context within which we have to manage them. And also in terms of decision making, that we reward appropriate risk taking through our performance management schemes. And lastly, in terms of competence, clearly we need to have a good, strong risk function, whether that's a chief risk officer and various risk champions through the organization, or whether it's more distributed in our organization. We have to make sure that the risk function has an appropriate status within the organization and that it's well resourced and empowered. And also that we have the necessary skills to manage risk effectively across the organization. So those are the 4 main aspects of the risk culture model and the elements, the diagnostic elements beneath them. And we could design a self-assessment questionnaire, or we could have a set of targeted interviews to assess the culture within our organization or our project team against the risk culture aspects model. So that's one way to develop risk culture, by doing some kind of benchmarking and gap analysis followed by an improvement program. But there's another way that we could develop risk culture, by going back to the ABC model. And in the ABC model, we see that culture is developed by repeated behavior. So maybe we could change our risk culture by changing our risk-based behavior. But behavior in turn is influenced by both the attitudes, the way we think, and then in a cycle by the culture that we're forming. And it turns out to be very hard to produce lasting change in behavior towards risk. And I'm sure if you've ever tried that in any of your organizations, you'll know that that's true. We can have policies and roadshows and communication and newsletters. We can have websites and we can have training courses. We can have new processes, all aiming to change our behavior towards risk. But in practice, people tend to go back to their old tried and tested methods, some of which may not be very appropriate. So although we do need to change behaviour, maybe that's not the right place to start. In the ABC model, we see that if we change our risk attitude, that will influence our risk behaviour, which in turn will develop our risk culture. So maybe the right thing to do is to start with risk attitude in terms of the ABC flow to change the way that people think about risk. So that in turn will drive their behaviour towards risk and form a more mature, risk-aware risk culture. So let's see how we might do that. How could you change your attitude to risk? Well, here I'd like to refer to some research which I've done with my colleague Dr. Ruth Murray Webster into the structure of risk attitude and the way it can be managed. If we wanted to draw a picture of the way that different people respond to risk, whether that's individuals or project teams or groups or whole organizations or even society, we could think that some people might have a positive response to uncertainty and others might have a negative response to uncertainty, and still others might have some kind of neutral position in the middle where they don't feel strongly either way. And we could draw a kind of diagram like this, a kind of double inverted utility curve, which shows that there are different strengths of positive response to uncertainty and different strengths of negative response to uncertainty. Now this is just a sketch, but you could see how any individual could be positioned at any position, any place on this particular curve, and so could any organization, ranging from very strongly positive to very strongly negative, passing through no real feeling one way or the other. In order to discuss this kind of curve, it's helpful if we divide it into zones, and typically this is done in three areas. We can talk about the most negative area, which we call risk averse. People are either strongly risk averse or maybe not so strongly. They feel, oh, risk is a bit worrying or risk is a disaster. On the right hand side, we have the positive response, which we call risk seeking. Either people say, oh yeah, risk, that's quite good, or fantastic, bring it on. More risk is more interesting. And in the middle, we talk about risk tolerant, where people just say, yeah, okay, risk is there, I have to deal with it, it's part of my job, it's nothing special. Now, showing that we have a range of potential risk attitudes for individuals and groups gives us three very important characteristics of risk attitude. The first is that risk attitude is variable. So you as an individual and I as an individual could adopt any position on that curve in different situations. So if we're talking about my job prospects, or we're talking about bringing up my children, or about managing my career or investing for my pension, in some circumstances I might be very risk averse, and other circumstances I might be very risk seeking. It depends. So risk attitude is variable. If it's variable, then I could choose my risk attitude intentionally. I could decide in a particular situation that I need to be, that I want to be more risk-seeking than is my natural preference. Or I could decide that I want to be more risk-averse. I need to be more risk-averse and more careful. Which brings us to the third key characteristic of risk attitude. Not only is it chosen and variable, but it can be managed. So let's think about how different people think about risk, those different attitudes to risk, and how that affects their behavior. And remember that we're looking for the values, beliefs, knowledge and understanding about risk that are held by different individuals and groups. And on this slide we've got some alternatives. You might have a look through and see where you sit. Some of them are more negative and some are more positive. For example, do you think that risk is avoidable, that we can manage it and we ought to try and minimize it? Or do you think that risk is just natural, it's part of everyday life, it's part of business, it's part of innovation, and we just have to accept it? Do you think that risk is a bad thing and it should be avoided and minimized as far as possible? Or do you welcome risk because it offers the opportunity for innovation and creativity and doing something that's not been done before? Do you think that high risk means that a situation is dangerous or that it's exciting, that risk should be prevented or exploited, and so on? You'll see the list of things here. And we might position ourselves in different places on that spectrum between bad and good, frightening or exciting, and so on. The question is, if attitude shapes behavior and behavior forms culture, and we want to try and manage our attitude, how can we change the way that we think about risk? Let me offer you one more model, not ABC this time, but this time 6 A's. And the 6 A's model starts with awareness, 2 A's, awareness and appreciation. The 6 A's model, developed by myself and Dr. Murray Webster, has a basis in emotional intelligence or emotional literacy, but we've developed it specifically for thinking about how we can manage our risk attitudes as individuals and groups. So it starts by looking at the ABC model in the top box with awareness and appreciation, understanding what our current risk attitude is, the way that we as individuals and groups think about risk, and then how that influences our risk-based behavior and ultimately our risk culture. So those are the first 2 A's, awareness, what's going on, appreciation, where did it come from? The third A is assessment. Is this okay? Is this attitude leading to appropriate behavior and building a positive culture? Or is this attitude leading to inappropriate behavior and the wrong risk culture? So we have an assessment step. And maybe we might use that cultural diagnostic that we talked about earlier to define that. And then we have 2 options. If we think from our assessment that our existing risk attitude is okay, and it's leading to good behavior and a strong risk culture, then we can just accept it. We can continue with that particular risk attitude, behavior and culture and see where it takes us. If on the other hand our assessment says, no, we're thinking wrong about risk, which is leading to the wrong kind of behavior and a weak or inappropriate risk culture, then we need to do something. We need to intervene, which leads us to the last 2 A's of the 6 A's model, which is assertion, describing the need for change and making sure everybody is on board with that, and then action, actually making the change. And you'll see that the last part of the 6 A's model is a feedback loop from the bottom, from the either acceptance or assertion and actions steps, in order to go back to assessment to say, well, is this still okay? Now we've made a change, is it still okay, or do we need to do something else? So I think the 6 A's model, although there's a lot of, again, depth behind it, and each of these A's has different stages and ways of diagnosing them and ways of implementing them, it gives us a fairly well-condensed, well-described framework for understanding our existing risk attitude and how it affects the way we behave, and deciding whether that's appropriate, and if not, changing it. And I think you could probably do that. You could probably implement the 6 A's framework in your organization, your project team, or for yourself as an individual. So let me finalize the presentation here with some last thoughts and try and draw the threads together. You'll remember that we started with some views from the street on what culture might mean, and we showed some pictures of culture in terms of art and drama and film and architecture and dance and music. We also showed some pictures in terms of agriculture, horticulture, and so on. These 2 sets of pictures were, of course, not random. They are 2 groups of views of culture which are very important. The first set of culture in terms of music and drama and film and so on is about how we express ourselves. And the second set in terms of agriculture and horticulture is to do with growing things. And both of those things are important aspects of our organizational culture and also of our risk culture. So the questions of self-expression are around who are we? What's our identity as an organization or as a project team? And what are we expressing out of that identity in terms of the way that we approach risk and the way that we manage it? And the issues around growth are similar. How are we growing? Are we growing towards or away from maturity? Are we being fruitful? What are we reproducing as we grow? Is it healthy or is it unhealthy? So I think these 2 groups of definitions of culture that we started with are actually quite interesting in terms of diagnosing our wider organizational culture in terms of self-expression and in terms of growth and reproduction. But they're also very important in terms of our risk culture, in terms of understanding how we express our views of risk and whether or not that's leading to something which is healthy and growing. Well, let me finish with the all-important so what slide. I hope you found some of these ideas interesting, but this is to summarize what we've seen through the ABC model. The ABC model is generic for all types of attitude, behavior, and culture. It links these three things together and shows that as attitude leads to behavior which forms culture, and culture in turn feeds back and influences the way we think and the way we act, we can form cycles which are reinforcing either for good or for bad. And the same is true of risk culture. We can have a cycle of the way we think about risk, of influencing our behavior towards risk, which forms our overall risk culture, and that in turn goes back and reinforces the way we think and act towards risk. We've also seen that risk culture matters. It's important for compliance reasons to avoid us making big mistakes, but also because it makes risk management more or less effective within our organization. It drives the way that we think about risk and the types of risk that we take within our organizations. It's also important to recognize that if we get risk culture wrong, if we have an inappropriate or weak risk culture, it can cause us problems, either taking too much risk or too little risk, which can lead to lack of growth or lack of innovation, or betting the company on something which ultimately turns out to fail. The recommendation from the ABC model is that we should assess our risk culture against some kind of framework. Maybe the IRM risk culture aspects model would be appropriate. But that we can change risk culture by going back through the ABC model to the beginning and starting with risk attitude, and using something like the 6 A's framework to intentionally understand, assess, and manage our risk attitude, which will lead through into changed behavior and ultimately a stronger culture. And that will enable us to take the right risks safely and enhance our chances of business and project success. Well, I hope you found that useful. I've mentioned several times in this presentation the research that was done with the Institute of Risk Management in 2012, and I was part of the core team that contributed to that, and particularly I brought the ABC model as one of the central themes of that report. And here you'll see the website for the IRM with the particular links that you can reach to get the risk culture reports. There's a short report which is aimed at boards, and that's free to download. And then there's a more detailed report called Resources for Practitioners, which gives all of the detailed research and the detailed resources that you can use to implement it. So the IRM risk culture reports are definitely worth reading. Well, that's the end of this short presentation on the ABC of risk culture. I hope you found it useful. I hope you can implement some of these ideas. I'm David Hilson, the Risk Doctor, and please do feel free to contact me if you have any questions or if you have any further thoughts on this subject. And we will, of course, be answering questions and answers as part of this ERM online risk conference later on. So thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you success in managing your risks. Goodbye.